Hi everybody, my name's Anthony Lowenstein. I'm an independent journalist, author and filmmaker living in East Jerusalem. Although I'm Australian, I've been living here on and off for the last 3 years and been visiting Israel-Palestine for 15 years. I'm so glad to be with you here tonight, albeit remotely, and Richard has kindly asked me some questions which I'm going to try to answer about the media, why it's so broken, why there's a little bit of hope somewhere, and hopefully give people some food for thought with the discussion where I wish I could be there in person, but alas, I'm rather far away. So let me read his questions and then answer them for you. Now, Donald Trump, the great US president who we all love to hate, has called the media enemy of the people. And this is dangerous for so many reasons. Although many journalists, and we'll get to this in a minute, fundamentally fail in their job, to call the media enemy of the people, makes it far more likely there'll be violence against journalists, and we're seeing that more and more in the US. In fact, in the latest Reporters Without Borders international study of journalists around the world, the US now is regarded as increasingly unsafe for media after, I think it was the last year or so, there was a mass shooting at one of the American news organizations and many people were killed. Violence and threats against journalists is going up, particularly against women. And that's a real concern. And when Trump, with the biggest megaphone in the world, with 60 million Twitter followers, millions and millions of Facebook and Instagram followers, makes those kind of allegations, it's dangerous. Let's not also forget, his view of the media is essentially propaganda. Fox News, run by Rupert Murdoch, is essentially now state TV in the US and globally. And that to me is a real danger, and we should resist that as strongly as possible. Next question is, does the mainstream media speak truth to power? Sadly, mostly not. And I think the reason for that, and I've seen this as a journalist now for 15 years, both in Australia and around the world, is most journalists, despite claiming they want to challenge power, actually want to be close to it. They want to be close to power, mix with power, socialise with power. So many of the stories that we see in the Australian media and much of the Western press aren't so much exclusives, but sanctioned leaks, drops. They call them drops, essentially press releases dressed up as a news story, given to a favoured journalist. This could be Labor or Liberal, it doesn't particularly matter. It's a bipartisan problem. And that to me is a real issue. So if you want to be a successful mainstream corporate journalist, you have to some extent play that game. There are some exceptions. There are good corporate journalists in Australia and around the world, but the vast majority of them actually don't want to upset power, because if they worry that if they do, they won't be actually asked into the intimate circle with future press releases or environmental events or whatever it might be. So I would say, yes, journalism too often does not challenge power, and I'm not convinced it necessarily is that different now to years ago. The whole concept of embedding, people often think of the term embedding meaning the ways in which journalists go with US or military forces post 9/11. That's obviously a form of embedding, going with US troops in Iraq or Afghanistan, reporting their point of view. But I think embedding is actually much worse than that. It's actually in many ways journalists who want to be so close to the halls of power, politicians, business and others, don't actually realise that until they have distance and are challenging power, the system will never change, which of course as a corporate journalist suits you very fine. Next question is, what changes to independent journalism have I seen over the years? Now, I've been a journalist now 15 years professionally in Australia and around the world, and the scorecard is mixed. On the one hand, there's never been more outlets to publish, obviously online. The mainstream media in some ways is crumbling. Institutions like the Financial Times and the New York Times are actually doing relatively well. They're often behind a paywall, so you have to pay after a short amount of articles to get access. And they're actually doing quite well, financially speaking. But of course, so much of other media is struggling. Newspapers are dying left, right and centre, and that to me is a real concern. And I think ultimately we're at a stage now with independent journalism, whether it's a writer or a blogger or a new startup, we need to put in our own money to help. There should be far more state funding. Don't get me wrong, much more government funding. But ultimately, we also, I think, if we can afford, and many of us cannot, but those who can, should think about subscribing to a publication and giving a monthly donation. Whatever that publication might be that you like or admire, or a journalist you like or admire. Don't be afraid to give them some cash, because believe me, most of us doing journalism ain't doing it for the money, because we're not getting that much of it. What are the implications of the recent Assange arrest in London? Complex question. In short, I've been a supporter of WikiLeaks since 2006, since right at the beginning of the WikiLeaks revolution, and I've followed this case very closely. I've met Assange a number of times, including in the Ecuadorian embassy a few years ago in London. And to me, this is a grave, grave concern. Simply put, Assange has many issues, and now's not the time to go into them, but I think ultimately this is an attempt to criminalise investigative journalism. Anyone who says Assange is not a journalist does not know what accountable journalism is. I've had issues with some of the WikiLeaks releases. Often they don't redact often enough as much as I believe they should. But ultimately this is an attempt by the Trump administration, many corporate journalists, to silence a dissident, which is what Assange is, from actually doing his job, challenging mainstream power. And for that reason, we should support what WikiLeaks and Assange has been doing. What media sources are worth accessing? Well, I read a wide variety, from the Financial Times, to the New York Times, to the Guardian, to Crikey, to a lot of corporate media, to a lot of independent media. And I often give money to independent media, Democracy Now!, Electronic Intifada, Haaretz here in Israel, Palestine, a range of other outlets, The Conversation. I think there's a lot of outlets that deserve support, and I would encourage people, if they like, as I said before, those outlets, don't be shy in giving them some money. And finally, why is independent journalism so important in our democracy? Simply put, if we rely on corporate mainstream journalism to actually hold power to account, that's not their job. Their job is to prop up power. And we've seen this in the current Australian election campaign, where too many journalists still play the game of getting on the bus with Scott Morrison or Bill Shorten and essentially report it as a game, a horse race. And ultimately, many people in the public want meatier discussion of issues. The Guardian's doing quite a good job, amongst others. But independent journalists need support. So for that, I would say support us in any way you can. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you guys in person soon. Thank you.